I swear there was something I needed to do. Oops. Hello there, ladies and gentlemen, it's Aaox. Sorry about the wait. YouTube's copyright system had precluded the upload of a video that a friend and I'd put a fair bit of work into, and also, I'm not gonna outright say I'm a lazy bastard, but you know, it's certainly possible. There was a time when I had dreams, a long time ago now, but there was a time, and in this dream, just as Earth was being devastated by a nuclear holocaust, I was sucked into a fantasy world, hailed as a hero, given a magical weapon that also transformed into a girl who, by all rights, may have just been my OC and this channel's mascot anime girl, Aisu, and I went off to save the world. Masturbatory, yes, relevant to this review of ReZero, a new entry into the oversaturated pantheon of media with this kind of plot? Incredibly so. Fantasy is, after all, a mirror that reflects the reality of those who look into it, providing us with ways to evaluate who we think we are, but the problem with calling attention to the looking glass is that if it's shattered, you can't go back again. Is that too pretentious? Sorry, I'm bookending. Welcome to my review analysis of ReZero Hajimeru ga something something world from zero. This is not, ladies and gentlemen, going to be a scathing indictment of the show. One should know beforehand that I don't make a point to be contrarian unless I deem it necessary or feel that there's something of worth in doing so, so understand that it's not every day I make sweeping generalizations like the following. There are a few shows that have disappointed me more than ReZero. I haven't felt this conflicted since I learned the truth about Bridget. ReZero baffles me to no end. It is on a basic level a good show, I want to make that clear. It's far more unique than most other shows I've seen recently, which is surprising given its premise. It's subversive and different, and that is something a lot of other anime should aspire to be, especially given that the standard interpretation of being subversive appears to be having one of the characters say, "How could this happen? This isn't anime," which is less subversive and more just taking a sledgehammer to the fourth wall because the shattered immersion and exasperated size of the audience are in some ways sexually fulfilling to the scriptwriter and they can't get off any other way anymore. But it's not without issue. It's an exercise in storytelling so oxymoronic that you just want to grab it by the shoulders and slap it while screaming in its face to make up its damned mind regarding what tone it's trying to go for before it hurts itself, but whoops, it's too late. It's gone into the fine china and now you're $1,000 down and you've got a show with 15 priceless ornamental plates stuck into its chest. The inability to truly commit to the very intelligent theme that ReZero comes so close to nailing is the death knell of what I was almost ready to call the Spec Ops the line of anime, and that is excruciatingly unfortunate. Its intentions were good, probably, but it couldn't separate itself from the medium enough to allow that message to sink in. We'll come back to that though, because I know you're all thinking the same thing. What f*** is ReZero? I can wait a few seconds for the shock of my apparent clairvoyance to die down before we continue. ReZero is yet another anime in which some random schmuck gets sucked into a fantasy world whilst out
late night shopping. It's fantastic.
Although on a first pass this might seem very straightforward, it takes the aforementioned guy gets teleported to another world narrative and runs with it in a direction that I initially read as sadistic, but later discovered was intelligently subversive, like that time Steve Owen dangled his child in front of a crocodile. What a hero. Rest in peace. The aforementioned schmuck is our protagonist Subaru, and the fantasy world in question is the wonderfully easy to pronounce Luginica, full of magic, wonder, and horrors matched only by the incomprehensible, shambling nightmares of the Lovecraftian mythos. Oh wait, sorry. Was the CG. Luginica is in political upheaval and Subaru finds himself allied, out of his own selfish desire, to our heroine, in theory at least, Amelia. She's a candidate for the crown, and Subaru wants to make her the ruler because they had to force a plot in here somewhere. You know, despite the fact that the medium's saturated with these sucked into another world narratives, I'm still partial to the device. There's a lot of inherent mystery involved with traveling to another world, and as I made a point of mentioning in my Grimgar review, I like when the process of getting there isn't initially elucidated. It sets up an effective question, provided one actually intends to go back and answer it, and it allows for us to learn about the world alongside Subaru from a blank slate perspective, which is great for creating intrigue regarding the circumstances and sympathy with the character. And that's exactly what the producers want you to do, because as we quickly find out, Subaru sucks, can't do anything, he has no skills, his magic is almost useless, and the most important thing he can do is die. That's it, that's our protagonist, that's our surrogate. Go team. And that's not a spoiler for those unfamiliar with the show's main hook, because Subaru does have a trick up his sleeve, something called Return by Death, which means he goes back to a certain point after he dies and can relive the events before he died and try to change the future. He can probably do this because of the meddling of a certain jealous witch, but the premise is draped in mystery so thick as to be completely obscured, certainly for the duration of this season at least. Unlike Grimgar, however, ambiguity is one of ReZero's anime adaptation's big problems. They might explain that in the light novels, but only nerds read light novels. But I digress. ReZero excels in its sound design. Not necessarily its soundtrack, but specifically its sound design. Often it's the use of music rather than music itself that can completely turn a mood, and in a manner corresponding to the use of colour in No Game No Life, the usage of sound present in ReZero informs the tone of any given scene. Just like a jilted lover, it's often said best when nothing is said at all. Another area in which the sound design excels is, of course, the voice acting. It takes a lot of skill to pull off characters that fluctuate between emotions as intense as the ones on display here, and the work showcase does an exceptional job almost across the board of informing the characters they belong to, with both Rem and Amelia having soft, lilting, melodic voices that would give the viewer reason to love them based on sound alone. And Subaru's bold, arrogant mannerisms highlight just how far he falls when his voice becomes a quiet, broken whisper. They feel real and actively add to the narrative, as opposed to simply existing within it, which is something very important for a show whose main conceit is unfortunately a source of frequent loss of support and character development due to resets. It's not as big of a problem as I thought it would be going in, so don't let that deter you. The bigger problems come later. Along the way, Subaru falls deeper and deeper into despair as he finds out that all of his blasé arrogance is actually misplaced. He is not the hero, he is not superior, he's just a dumb idiot who doesn't know anything about the world he's trapped in, and that's a direct indictment of us, the audience. In a certain episode around the halfway mark, he's finally had enough, and spends over 3 minutes cursing himself out as a weak coward whose arrogance causes more problems than it solves, and how his lazy lifestyle back in Japan condemned him to fail and Luke Nika. When the viewer surrogate is saying this,
あれだけ時間があって、あれだけ自由があって、なんだってできたはずなのに、何にもやってこなかった。その結果がこれだ。その結果が今の俺だ。俺の無力も無能も全部が全部、俺の腐りきった性根が理由だ。何もしてこなかったくせに何かを成し遂げたいだなんて思い上がるにも限度があるだろうよ。
It's hard to read that as anything but the show's creators calling out their audience and saying, "You anime-watching bastard, you trash, you're not a hero, you're just some loser who has to get a latte because black coffee's too bitter for you." You can throw Tappei Nagatsuki in there with Hideaki Anno and Hayao Miyazaki as creators who despise and ridicule their audience. You know, are they wrong to call us out on that? I mean, I made my own anime girl. There's got to be a small nugget of truth in their doing so. That's why I opened this review with that dream example. I didn't make that up. That's a real dream I had. That's a dream influenced by my fantasies, born from the media I consume, whilst in real life I do nothing to change anything. The show called me out, and I loved it for it. Not infatuation, but more the kind of hate-filled love you feel when someone pulls one over on you in magnificent style and you just sit there thinking, "Oh, you clever bastard." It takes a lot of courage to be willing to directly indict your audience, hence why I called it the Spec Ops: The Line of Anime earlier. It wasn't a comparison made in jest, and that's probably the most important thing that ReZero really has going for it. And it's where everything I actually liked about ReZero both solidified and completely fell apart. Literally the minute after Subaru's lowest point, Rem, our real heroine, to which the internet agrees, tells Subaru how great he is, like,
"Yes! You're the toughest, craziest, most hardcore badass on the planet! You're the shit!"
And after a swift recovery, he's a total regular generic hero for the remainder of the show. Despite the scene where she does so being this cathartic scene where she says everything we wished someone would say to Subaru, where he's finally told it's alright, despite it being beautiful visually and auditorially with actual, substantial emotional payoff and charming animation, My genuine reaction at the time when watching it was to announce that I was, and this is a direct quote, almost disgusted at how much it ran against the only legitimately fantastic thing I thought ReZero had. That and Amelia. It's about as jarring as a tonal shift can get, as though the writers just got fed up of writing the conflict between Subaru's goals and his character and just resolved it in their lunch break so they could write a story about trying to kill a whale because Herman Melville did it and worked out well for him. It gets absolutely ludicrous, to the point where it devolves into a complete accidental self-parody, emulating the worst aspects of the medium and the audience expectations that just a few episodes prior was condemning as being awful wish fulfillment. And the worst part is they do it with a straight face. There's having one's cake and eating it, and then they're screaming at you forever, deigning to think that you might be able to eat cake one moment, only to lovingly feed it to you the next, cooing gentle reassurances about how marvelously you chew. I sincerely wish that I were joking about this. Soup's character does a complete 180. He leads a small, private army to fight a giant monster and stop a band of genuinely scary and enigmatic villains, with the notable exception of Betelgeuse, who is an awful character that grinds harder than a Hyperdimension Neptunia game, and Subaru does this whilst meeting, talking to, and being an integral part of the machinations of all the most important people in that world. And this is nonsensically placed right after the harshest indictment of the audience the show has in store. This is right after they pull the curtain back and reveal a picture of you wasting your time dicking around on the internet dreaming about being a hero, and they revel in your inadequacy. It's the most discombobulating thing about my opinion on ReZero. I hated the show early on. Genuinely. I dreaded the next episode every time the previous one ended with that morbid, I have to know but I don't want to find out feeling that's been responsible for more than a few awful trips through the dark side of the internet. Now, this is a hot tip from someone who gets his rocks off by overanalyzing things. If you're spending your time thinking, God, I don't want to watch more of this, that's probably not a fantastic indication of a series quality. It actually culminated in me completely dropping it when I reached episode 12 because I'd had enough. I was done. With other media texts, there's oftentimes a raison d'etre going on throughout. We in the know usually call this the plot, and this is where ReZero's ambiguity really comes back to bite it. We have no idea what goal Subaru is aiming for beyond dating Amelia, and I mean, I suppose one can't blame him for that, but ideally one takes actions in service of a larger goal. Yes, Luke Skywalker thought Princess Leia was attractive, but that wasn't the impetus for the entire dramatic arc of the original trilogy. Thank God. No! Of course, my aim isn't to be reductive. Toyota does pick up smaller goals, like saving other characters, but there is no overarching endgame beyond maybe, fix the world and get Amelia elected and find out who the witch is, I guess. And whilst I think that kind of directionless setup works in a character study like Grimgar, no steps are taken to further them beyond let's try and stop whatever went wrong in this current instance from happening. And usually the things that went wrong only serve to push Subaru further away from achieving those three main goals. It's a show of constant, pervasive setbacks, and the main goals are also lofty: solve racism, get that universe's equivalent of a Hitler impersonator elected, and locate and defeat a witch so powerful and elusive that to most of the inhabitants of that world, the task is practically Sisyphean, that it just can't take its own weight, and thus there is no real progression. Hence, when Subaru had saved the character who needed saving and they thanked him, I turned it off, because the only place the show could go from there was back down into another arc of things going horribly wrong. Every happy moment had to, by necessity, be the setup to a joke in which emotional torture was the punchline. And that's a very poor way to tell a story. For all the pomp and circumstance involved in its reception, it had rubbed me the wrong way since episode 4, but at the time, I had no idea why specifically it was doing that beyond my dislike of the aforementioned sadism and cruelty that is unfortunately inherent to the return by death premise. The author's goading tweet about expecting hate mail when the next episode aired only served to further validate my initial belief that ReZero was an exercise in torturing the viewer for its own sake, and my reaction to it at the time was vehement. I detested the first half of ReZero for the same reasons I detest films like Saw and video games produced like David Cage. I mean, I get it. The light-hearted rom-com elements of the show serve to make the horror elements that much more jarring and awful, and it works. But the problem is that it works perhaps too well and is in service to nothing but shock value. A lot of the deaths struck me like that one fucking awful out-of-place sequence in Jurassic World with the pteranodon that means poor Susie can't even approach recreational water parks without screaming incoherently about Leopleurodons. And yes, that may have been their intention, but that doesn't mean I have to like it. It might be the most delicious sushi in the world, but that doesn't mean I've suddenly started to enjoy seafood, or in ReZero's case, wishing death upon myself. The only reason why I came back to it and finished watching it was due to that same morbid curiosity coupled with a friend telling me that the show got a lot, and I quote, better after the big shift in episode 18. And what kills me, and is the real sticking point about my opinion on ReZero, is that I actually kind of think it does, but it sacrifices the subversion to do it. Remember what Picasso said, if it's not self-flagellation, it's not art. Perhaps that's an understatement. So here's my ultimate takeaway on ReZero. For the first half, I despised it, but learned to appreciate and respect what it was trying to say on an artistic level, which is not something I normally say about anime. For the latter half, I found it much more entertaining and watchable on a very basic level as pure media entertainment, but found the shift in intention to be excruciatingly hypocritical. In layman's terms, I hated it, but I loved it, then I liked it, so I despised it. And you know, hypocritical really is the word of the day when it comes to discussing ReZero. I'm sure some people will call me a hypocrite for liking the ambiguity in Grimgar and disliking it in this as well, but there's just so much that ReZero wants to get right, and almost does, to the point where I'd nearly describe it as groundbreaking, only for it to go back on itself and destroy everything it had worked to build for the sake of creating a more fundamentally enjoyable piece of media. You can't slap and insult me, then moments later hug me and expect me not to feel like I'm getting a few mixed messages here. With all that said, I'm shocked more people aren't calling it out for what I can only see retrospectively as two halves of what could have been two fantastic shows, one subversive and grotesque and one traditionally enjoyable and exhilarating. But unlike chocolate and peanut butter or looking at the British economy and feeling a growing sense of existential dread, these are not two great tastes that taste great together. Looking back at my time spent with Subaru and the gang, all I can really see is the wasted potential. Hindsight's 2020, of course, and wasted potential is a damn sight better than I can't bear to look at this horrible burning pile of garbage, but in the land of those blinded by ReZero's perceived quality, the one-eyed arsehole critic is king, if only of ruining the buzz. I would, despite everything, recommend ReZero. But that recommendation does not come without severe qualifying statements. If you were to ask me if I liked this anime, I don't know if I'd actually say that I did and mean it. I certainly didn't enjoy watching it, but I very much appreciate what it did, at least to start with. It's the perfect metaphor for that saying about Mussolini and the punctuality of trains. That's 2 jokes at the expense of some of history's greatest monsters, folks. Keep a counter, we don't do things by halves over here at Aaox Incorporated. Transported to another world shows are, unfortunately, extremely common. At least one per season every season is the norm, and you know, there's a reason for that. It's a very fitting setup for audience projection. We can relate far more to the normal person who's sucked into a fantasy world than the person who always lived there. There is a reason, after all, why reality and mundane are synonymous, so it makes sense that if one desires the fantastical, it should only be able to transpire within a fantasy. However, especially in Japanese culture with respect to the ideas of hon and tatemae, the concept of turning one's back on the reality in which we find ourselves to pursue personal goals, to date the attractive elf girl, to use magic, to be the most important, unique person in that world, is something that is perhaps seen by some as being worthy of derision. ReZero's indictment of the audience is a clever, well-produced mirror that elucidates to us the pathos inherent in our desire to trade in this current world for a more exciting one. So its regression into a much more watchable show feels as disingenuous as anything I've ever seen, and the truly disappointing thing about ReZero, the lesson its narrative didn't learn, is that once you've shattered the looking glass, you can't go back again.